Kingdom Claus. Book 1. By Adam David Brown. Chapter 1. The First Garrison. It was noon under a pale sky. It was just after the mid-winter cusp, so the days were often grey and cold, very cold. The winters in the north were a long droning song without the politeness of the sun. All was still, save for a breeze that whistled around the pointed stones of the ramparts high upon the walls of the southernmost garrison. It was a long stone wall that sat in front of a small fortress. This was the last garrison to be built in Kingdom Claus, and it was the first garrison to be in defense of the northern kingdom. There wasn't much of a reason to be on guard these days, for there had long since been any threats. There would occasionally be bands of marauders from the free mountains or pillagers from the eastern wastes, or bandits far too bold for their own good, but never any ill force that would dare brave the wall. Lately there had been some whispers of a growing shadow in the south, far south within the kingdom of Gordival. But this would be seen as nothing more than rumors from idle soldiers. Upon the watchtower stood a soldier clad in fur and leather armor. He stared out into the vast plains of snow. "What do you see? Anything in sight?" A voice bellowed from below. "No, Captain." "Not but snow," the young soldier answered. "Aye. And I suspect that's all you'll see today," the voice replied. This was Captain Borrow, a broad man with a red beard, cloaked in a long fur coat. He controlled this garrison and was a lieutenant to whom was known as Donner, one of the 8 spears, the elite guard of the king. Hanging from his belt was a long sword that hadn't been unsheathed, except to be sharpened, in a long while. To his left and right stood 2 tall soldiers suited in leather plates and long dark red coats, trimmed in fur. In their gloved hands were long pikes, that hadn't proved to be much more than decorations as of late. For these days were quiet, but Captain Borrow felt that it was too quiet. He was older and had seen battles great and small, and he knew that through both peace and war, it was never completely quiet. But it was silent. An eerie silence. It was a still and quiet that didn't seem right. To the younger troops, it wasn't wrong for it to be quiet and for the work to be light. However, the older captain was suspicious. He had seen too much blood spilt upon the snow to not be. The silence wasn't natural. There was always something going on, and for there not to be was a strange thing to him. It was as if something was hiding. "I comes an owl, Captain," a voice rang out from the northern post of the fortress. The lands were vast between each of the garrisons, and sending messages via owls was the best way to communicate. They were snow owls, big, yet swift and quiet upon the wind. Their white feathers blended with the pale skies, making them perfect to evade capture from enemies. Their long legs were well suited for tying scrolls to. "Keep your watch, soldier," said Captain Borrow as he turned. Followed by his 2 wards, Captain Borrow briskly walked across the courtyard and into the arched doorway of the fortress. The 2 wards took their posts at each side of the doorway as Borrow continued down the dark torchlit hallway. He came to the end of the hall and opened the wooden door of his quarters. There on a perch by an open window sat a large snow owl with a scroll tied to his left leg. "Aye, traveller. What news have you for me?" Captain Borrow said as he smiled and approached the winged messenger. The owl cooed as Borrow untied the scroll. He patted the owl on the head and unrolled the message. It read, "Captain Borrow of the 1st Garrison. By way of news from the Free Mountains, we have received word that King Mandor of Gordival has perished. The rumor is that it was in ill and was the work of assassins. By order of King Claus, you are to send emissaries to Gordival in goodwill and to find if these rumors are true. Make it known that we offer aid and tidings if such is necessary. Donner." Upon reading this, Borrow looked up to his scribe, a Vendigum named Winijig, who sat at a small desk, holding a quill. "What news, sire?" the scribe asked, seeing that the captain was visibly shaken. Borrow's eyes glinted in the candlelight and his face went gaunt. He felt this news was the reason he had felt so suspicious of the utter quiet. "The king in the south is dead," he exclaimed. "We must ready emissaries." Winijig spread out a piece of parchment over his little desk, dipped his quill into the ink, and began writing a reply to the great castle of Claus. He rolled up the message, sealed it with wax, and tied it to the owl's right leg. Winnijig fed the owl a small piece of roasted rabbit, petted its feathers, and sent it on its way. The owl flew off into the pale sky, onward to the north, to the great castle in the heart of Kingdom Claus. Captain Borrow walked into the main hall of the fortress and called forth Brother Halding, a monk who was the resident cleric in the garrison and was the chief emissary of the southern region of the northwestern kingdom. He was a rather humble-looking young man. He had only been appointed chief emissary the previous winter after the priest whom he apprenticed for took ill and died. Brother Halding may have been too young for his position, but he was happy to serve the kingdom that had brought him such mirth. For when he was a small child, bandits had attacked his village and killed his parents, leaving him all alone amongst the coldness of the sacked ruins. King Claus VI heard of this attack, threw down the bandit horde, and took in not only Halding, but all of the orphans of this desolated village. It was, in fact, this attack that prompted the southernmost garrison to be built. Halding walked into the main hall and stood before Captain Borrow, dressed in a tattered brown robe, dirty leather boots, and a wide-brimmed black hat. He awaited Borrow's orders. "You wish to see me, Captain?" Halding asked, still holding the day's journal entry. Borrow's voice fell to a broad whisper. "We have received ill news of the south. The king is dead." Borrow explained, slightly bowing his head. "Dead? Mandor?" Halding replied in shock. "Aye. It is said to be the deeds of an assassin. Though it is not yet clear. I need you to ride to Califor at first light. Offer counsel and Claus's goodwill," Borrow said, firmly placing a hand upon Halding's shoulder. Halding thought a moment and said, "There is no known steward for the throne. They will be leaderless." Borrow looked upon Brother Halding with great concern, as if he were seeing the future unfold before him. "Aye. The only ones next in line would be their tax collectors and bookkeepers. I fear this shall be the last bit of grain to break the kingdom of Gordival. And whatever havoc be wrought there, could very well reach across the White Plains," Borrow said quietly. "I've only just reached this position, what good would I bring?" Halding replied nervously. "I've only settled squabbles between villagers over their chickens, I couldn't possibly." Borrow raised his hand, interrupting the babbling monk and said, "You will have to do then. Ready your party." Brother Halding sighed and went on his way. The evening's supper was quiet and the night quieter still. There was a silent tension in the air, for the news of King Mandor had reached each of the 100 troops stationed at the garrison. As midnight rolled over the ramparts, the soldiers on night watch could have sworn that they heard the whispers of voices upon the wind coming out of the south. They couldn't be sure, but they thought it best to keep it to themselves. The cold stillness of the night was unlike any they had felt before. The dawn slowly crept over the hills and first light found Brother Halding preparing his sleigh. It was an old range sleigh, one which had seen battle but long ago. It had nicks, faded brown paint, and marks where arrows had pierced it. It had previously been in service from the forces of the great castle and now it was in service to the southernmost garrison. It was second-hand, but it was noble and functional, perfect for a monk. Halding put the last of the party's supplies in the back of the sleigh and turned to adjust the reins of the two broad steeds that would make the pull across the White Plains. The north had two kingdoms, one in the southeast, which was the kingdom of Gordival, and the other was Kingdom Claus that lay in the northwest. In between the two realms was what was known as the White Plains, a vast flat stretch of nothing but miles upon miles of snow. This was the great divide of the north that separated the two kingdoms. It would be a treacherous journey for any who took the miles under sleigh. For anyone to make this journey between the two kingdoms, they would need strong and stout horses. But the people of the north would come to realize that normal horses were not suited for the harshness of the land. So the Vendigum would help create a breed of horse that could conquer the vastness of the north. These would be known as broad steeds, larger and stronger than the other native horses, and with much thicker hair and manes. And these would be the horses that were now harnessed to Brother Halding's range sleigh. Out of the garrison stables came 3 riders astride brown broad steeds. The riders were troops adorned with leather armor, fur-lined helms, and long brown fur coats. Upon their livery was stitched weaving golden lines, the official horse furnishings of the royal Claus emissary. The riders assembled in the courtyard in a triangulated position and Brother Halding drove the sleigh in behind them. The rider at point wore upon his helm a shining golden band, and carried a great green and red banner with the insignia of a white reindeer sewn upon it. This was the royal crest of Claus. "Open the gate," a loud voice echoed through the garrison. The iron gate slowly swung open and a bitter wind blew through the courtyard. The royal banner flew proudly within the cold air and the emissary party began their ride across the great white plains. Captain Borrow watched from the wall as they sped off into the horizon, leaving a long cloud of billowing snow behind them. He then climbed down the stairs and made his way to his quarters. "There's something fell at work here," Borrow said to Winijig, who was hunched over his desk, writing the garrison's daily log. "I feel something also, sire," Winijig replied, as if he were relieved to hear that someone else thought the same and that he wasn't just being paranoid. "I don't know what it is, but I feel as though there is an axe about to fall, a hammer upon an anvil," Borrow said, gazing out of his window. A slight breeze blew through the open window, bristling his red beard. His eyes rose and he exclaimed, "I must send word to Claus at once." Winijig hastily wrote down Borrow's message and took the scroll to the garrison's perch house. He tied the scroll upon the left leg of Montegil, the swiftest snow owl in the southernmost garrison. Winijig then instructed the owl to the silver perch. And Montegil took off towards the northern horizon. Later that evening, the emissary party of Kingdom Claus approaches the front gate of Califa. Califa was a township under the rule of the Kingdom of Gordival. It was a tremendous marketplace, a border town that was the first settlement you would reach on the northern edge of Gordival. Halding thought it was strange that it was dusk and the front gates were still wide open. Though the streets and the markets were usually open through the night, the front gates were surely always closed to outsiders after nightfall. So this was a strange sight. "Let us slow our pace here. Something must be amiss," Halding said to the three riders. The party slowly drove through the gates and into the main courtyard. This courtyard was normally a thriving entity, with music and bustling. For there were many taverns, and inns, and markets filled with life, always well into the night. But not this night. It was as quiet as a graveyard. There was no one about, not a soul. "Perhaps they are grieving their king," Halding supposed to the three troops. "Aye, brother, but taxes do not grieve," the soldier to Halding's left said with a laugh. "This town should still be alive," he continued. Further into the town the party pushed on until they reached the town hall in the heart of Califa. The party looked upon a great stairway that led up to an even greater house, with two tall oaken doors. Halding began to dismount the sleigh when the doors of the great house opened. From the street, the party saw glimmering torchlight coming out of the doorway. Silhouettes of three figures emerged in front of the orange light. "I suppose that you're an envoy from Claus," a snide voice said from the doorway. Halding arose and said, "Indeed. I am Brother Halding. I am an emissary from the southern garrison of the Kingdom Claus." The figures came into the light of the street lamps. There stood two Gordivalian soldiers in silver helmets and holding spears, their faces lifeless and cold. Between the two soldiers stood a short and rather plump man adorned with a thick copper necklace and a flowing silver cape. On his face he wore a black and grey beard and a coldness of scorn. "What brings the good kingdom of Claus this far south?" the man sneered. "We bring tidings and counsel in your time of sorrow," Halding announced, nervously. "Ah, I see. I am Dolder, Baron of Califa. And I say to you and the good King Claus that we refuse your tidings," Dolder exclaimed. The party was shocked to hear this declaration. "You what?" Halding replied, stunned. At this time, shadowy figures began stirring quickly throughout the streets. The party took notice and the broad steeds became uneasy. It would seem that the emissary party was being surrounded, and as the figures came into the light, they could see that these figures were Gordivalian troops with spears and swords drawn. Their silver helmets shone under the lamp lights. The torches saw them with angry eyes. "To think," Dolder yelled, "that we would accept help and counsel from the very kingdom whom had our fair king killed." Halding was very troubled and confused as Dolder continued. "Our King Mandor, whose blood is on the very hand that is now outstretched to us. It is the Kingdom Claus whose assassins have taken our king from us. The demons from the north who have taken our king and now wish to take our lands." The party was now in a confused panic, the broad steeds shaken. And behind the Gordivalian soldiers began to grow a mass of angered townsfolk, and they started to chant what sounded like, "Kill them! Kill them!" The 3 emissary soldiers drew their swords with a shining sound, and Brother Halding stood upon the sleigh and exclaimed, "We did not kill your king. By whose word have you come to say this?" Dolder was incensed. "Not only usurpers, but liars they be as well," he raged, his voice cracking with anger. "Enemies you have sworn with us. All treaties are henceforth broken." Halding shouted, "By whose command do you declare this?" Dolder stepped closer into the torchlight and said as a slither, "Lord Amaranth." It was in the faint torchlight that Halding noticed that there was not only anger in Dolder's eyes, but a strange yellow tint as well. Halding seemed puzzled and said, "Amaranth?" Dolder was at full wrath and screamed, "Seize them! Seize the northern devils!" The circle of Gordivalian soldiers rushed in on the party, spears at point and raising their swords. 2 of the emissary troops tried fending off the mob, but were pushed off their mounts and promptly pierced with spears. The bannerman's broad steed rose up on its hind legs, throwing its rider to the ground. Their 2 Gordivalian troops stabbed at him with their glimmering swords. The troops then rushed the sleigh, grabbing Brother Halding and throwing him to the snowy street. 2 troops grabbed him by an arm each and dragged him before Dolder. There at the steps of the great house, Halding was held on his knees. He looked around to see his emissary troops lay slain. Halding rose up his head to Dolder and asked, "What madness is this?" A Gordivalian soldier picks up the fallen banner of Claus and hands it to Dolder. With banner in hand, Dolder replied, "This is what you have planted and this is what you shall sow." Halding gathers his breath and says, "This is an act of war." "It indeed is," Dolder replied, and then broke the banner over his knee. He throws the broken halves on the ground in front of Halding and says in a raspy voice, "What an honor it is to have a Clausian monk within the houses of Califa. You shall make a great ransom, emissary." "Jail him," he sneered. A soldier strikes Halding across the face, knocking him unconscious. His arms still held by the soldiers, they raise him up and drag him down the snowy streets of Califa's main row. It was daybreak across the great white plain, and behind the wall of the southern garrison stood Captain Borrow. Feeling unsure of the stillness in the air, he had hardly slept. His 2 wards join his side and Borrow goes to relieve the night watch on the wall. He crosses through the courtyard and climbs the stairs to the rampart. "How goes the night?" "All clear," Borrow asked the 5 troops stationed upon the wall. Captain Borrow was a good man, he ran the garrison with not stern discipline but with friendship. Friendship to his troops. It was a brotherhood that was founded not in fear but in respect. For loyalty from his men was easily brought, and those who were under his command thought it no task at all. "Aye, Captain." "Not but night." "All quiet," replied a fur-clad soldier. And throughout the stillness of the morning air came what sounded like a lone sleigh skidding across the snow from the south. Captain Borrow looked out across the white plains to the southern horizon to see a small cloud of snow, kicked up like dust upon a wicked wind. Borrow and the 5 troops stared at the cloud as it drew closer. "Scope," Borrow said, outstretching his hand. A soldier hands the captain a small telescope. Borrow peers through and sees what looks like a sleigh being pulled by 2 panicked steeds. It was the emissary sleigh. "It's empty," Borrow said, crestfallen and confused. The sleigh and its team galloped closer to the garrison. "Open the gates," Borrow commanded, and the large iron gates swung open. The 2 broad steeds knew not what had happened but knew enough to return from whence they came. The sleigh flew through the gate and into the courtyard with a frantic cloud of snow following like a phantom. A soldier brings the steeds to a halt with a stern "Whoa!" The flying snow catches up to the halted sleigh and settles around it. Captain Borrow runs to inspect the sleigh. Comforting the steeds, he sees that they are shaken and their eyes burned with fear. Several troops join the inspection and see that the supplies are gone and that the broken banner lay upon the driver's seat, torn and dirted. "What has happened here?" Borrow asked in a ghostly whisper. "Perhaps bandits, sire," one of the troops said, extending his hand to the empty cargo hold. "See here, the supplies are gone," the soldier added. Bandits would not dare attack the banner of Claus, and certainly not in midwinter. They surely wouldn't be prepared for such a move in the deathly cold, Captain Borrow replied, scratching his head. The bandits that roamed throughout the eastern wastes and through the free mountains were lowly renegades. They were not well supplied enough to brave such a bold attack in the bitter midwinter winds. Their lives would not be worth a small cache of supplies, the winter would certainly take their breath from them. They would only venture to rob merchants through the daylight and save their big scores for the spring and summer. This was not the work of bandits, and it certainly didn't seem as such to Borrow. Captain Borrow then picked up the two broken halves of the banner and looked upon them inquisitively. And why break the banner? Where is the emissary party? Where is Brother Halding? He asked with dread. It was then that a low and large rumble came across the white plains from the southern horizon. Captain Borrow and the few soldiers looked through the still open gate to see a long white cloud of snow that seemed to be stirred up from a great host. The cloud drew nearer. "Captain! Something comes," a soldier upon the wall shouted. Borrow ran up the stairs to the top of the wall and looked again through the telescope. Through the small hole, he saw beneath the long cloud of stirred snow was indeed a great host. It was a long line of horsemen, raging forth in great haste with swords drawn. By the shimmering silver helms he could see that these were Gordivalian soldiers, rolling like a swift tide across the great white plain. And as they drew closer still, Borrow saw that it was not one long line of horsemen, but several deep, all raging towards the garrison. The rumble grew louder, and under its roar, all within the garrison heard the yells of impending battle. Borrow looked on in shock and shouted, "Close the gate! To your positions!" All 100 of the southernmost garrison's troops hurried and hastily formed their ranks upon the wall and in the courtyard behind the gate. They were frantic but steady, for they were not ready for battle on this morn. Things had been quiet and still for a long time, and now it would seem they must repel an invasion. Captain Borrow turned and ran down the stairs and through the courtyard to the fortress. Bursting through its door, he yelled for Winijig. "Send forth an owl to Captain Forsyth at the second garrison. And then steal away to the storehouse. We are under attack." Winijig acknowledged his sire and ran for the perch house. Vendigums by nature were swift creatures, sometimes the Northmen would hardly notice them but for a shadow. And Vendigums were naturally brave and stout of heart, but one who was a scribe and a poet such as Winijig was, would not fare well in battle. Winijig ran into the perch house and set free a smaller snow owl, with no message. When an owl was received with no message, that meant only to send aid in great haste. "Go, my friend, short north to the garrison," Winijig said and released the small owl through the window of the perch house. Owls of the north were wise and clever, as they could understand some language but knew emotions much better. This little owl surely knew the haste of his mission and flew from the perch house onward to the second garrison, which lay miles and miles north of Captain Borrow's station. Winijig then runs to the storehouse, opens a hatch within the floor, and climbs down a narrow stairway into the basement, closing the hatch behind him. On the great white plain, the host of Gordivalian soldiers reach the garrison wall. Saying no words, they begin their siege of the first garrison. Archers within the courtyard fire a volley and arrows rain down upon the invaders from the other side. As the first line begins to break, many Gordivalian soldiers bring forth great ladders to mount upon the wall. Ladders! Borrow yells to his men and troops atop the wall try in vain to push them down, but the Gordivalian numbers are too great and they crest the rampart. Clausian troops and Gordivalian soldiers now clash atop the wall. Two kingdoms that had not raised arms against each other for a century and a half were now clinched in the grasp of combat. The ringing of clanging swords could be heard throughout and within the walls of the garrison. "Push them back," Borrow commands, but his troops are swamped and were now outnumbered. All of the 20 men stationed on the wall fell, all but one, who ushered Captain Borrow down the stairs and into the courtyard. Captain Borrow and the surviving wall trooper now stand amongst the archers, who launch another volley at the invading host. Their arrows are true and hit their marks, and waves of Gordivalian troops fall from the wall like clumps of melting snow in the spring. For a moment, all is quiet, and then from outside the gate came an echoing horn blow. The company inside the garrison wall could not see, but before the gate now rolled a great iron battering ram upon an oaken wagon. There was a low screech of metal and a thunderous boom upon the garrison gate. Again and again it wailed as Borrow and his company stood fast. Upon the fifth boom, the gates crashed open and a legion of Gordivalian troops and horsemen stormed through into the courtyard. The archers drew their swords and Borrow bellowed out, "Hold the line, ye great men of the north." A great clashing of steel rang out once again, but Captain Borrow and his brave men were overwhelmed, and, a few long moments later, the clashing stopped, the courtyard went quiet, and all of the southernmost garrison's troops lay slain in defense of their charge. Blooded and muddied, Captain Borrow stood alone, surrounded by Gordivalian soldiers who stood with their spears upon him. The southernmost garrison was the last to be built in Kingdom Claus and would be the first to fall. The adventure continues with Chapter 2, The Silver Perch.